In the ongoing war in Ukraine, both NATO and Russia have established critical red lines, actions that, if crossed, could provoke severe responses and escalate the conflict. Understanding these red lines is key to grasping the risks of this war, spiraling into a broader conflict. For NATO, the first and most well-known red line is any direct attack on NATO territory. According to Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, an attack on one member is considered an attack on all, triggering a collective defense response. If Russia were to launch military actions against Eastern European countries like Poland or the Baltic states, it would likely spark a significant NATO military response. Another red line for NATO is the use of weapons of mass destruction, whether nuclear, biological, or chemical. If Russia were to use these weapons in Ukraine, it could lead to direct military intervention by NATO, raising the stakes dramatically. Cyber warfare is also a growing concern. If Russia were to launch large-scale cyber attacks on NATO members, disrupting vital infrastructure, NATO could respond with either cyber retaliation or invoke Article 5, depending on the severity of the attack. Finally, any expansion of Russian military aggression into non-NATO countries like Moldova or Georgia could trigger a broader NATO involvement, especially if these actions threaten Europe's overall security. From Russia's perspective, one of its most critical red lines is direct NATO involvement in Ukraine. Although NATO is supplying advanced weapons to Ukraine, Moscow views the deployment of NATO troops as a direct provocation that could escalate the war into a NATO-Russia conflict. Russia has also made it clear that any attacks on its internationally recognized territory could provoke a severe response. This includes regions near Ukraine's border, like Belgorod and Kursk. Russia treats attacks on annexed territories, like Crimea, differently but would likely respond aggressively to strikes on core Russian cities. The idea of Ukraine joining NATO remains a major red line for Russia. Moscow views the possibility of NATO forces being stationed close to its borders as an intolerable security threat. Another red line for Russia is Western military strikes on Russian assets, such as bases or fleets. Any direct confrontation between Western forces and Russian forces could trigger a retaliatory strike, escalating the conflict further. Lastly, attempts to destabilize Russia internally or promote regime change are seen by Moscow as an existential threat. Any significant Western support for opposition movements in Russia could be met with severe responses. So, what happens if these red lines are crossed? For NATO, a breach of their red lines, such as a direct attack on a NATO member or the use of weapons of mass destruction, would almost certainly result in collective military action under Article 5. This could range from airstrikes to cyber retaliation, or even full-scale military involvement. For Russia, if their red lines are crossed, such as NATO's direct involvement in Ukraine or attacks deep within Russian territory, the consequences could be far more dangerous, possibly including escalated conventional warfare or even the use of tactical nuclear weapons, as Russian officials have hinted. In this volatile situation, both NATO and Russia are walking a fine line. The choices made in the coming months will determine whether the conflict remains contained or spirals into something far more dangerous.